Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our CAQH Core participant call on prior authorization. First, I'd like to mention a few logistical items. You can download a copy of today's presentation from the CAQH.org website a day or two after this session. Also, a copy of the slides and the webinar recording will be emailed to all of you, as well as the registrants in the next 1 or 2 business days. We'll save plenty of time after today's program in order to respond to your questions and take your comments. You're encouraged to submit your questions or comments at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. I'd like to thank our guest speaker from Humana, Kim Peters, who's the process owner for Provider Process Implementation at Humana, Inc. I'll introduce him properly a little bit later in the program. Today, we'll start off with a presentation on background and the CAQH core work and role in prior authorization. We'll then walk through the work the PA advisory group has done. And then finally, we'll discuss the creation of the PA subgroup and do our best to pique your interest so we can work together on this very important topic for our industry. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Core Manager, Rachel Goldstein. Rachel?
Thanks, Jessica. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. While prior authorization seeks to manage healthcare utilization by requiring approval for certain meds and prescriptions, we know that the process can be burdensome to stakeholders, including providers, health plans, and patients. Many of you on the call today are very familiar with PA, the process, and some of its key challenges. But before we dive into our work in PA, we want to share some baseline facts so that we can all start from the same page. From an administrative transactions perspective, we know that the PA business process occurs outside of and separate from the eligibility process and the claims process. We know that a prior auth approval doesn't necessarily guarantee patient eligibility or provider reimbursement. Really, these silos can result in the patient paying for a service out of pocket and or can jeopardize provider reimbursement. We know that in the commercial market alone, there are at least 71 million PAs submitted and responded to each year. And of these, the CAQH index tells us that about 35% are submitted manually, meaning phone, fax, email, and 65% are submitted using partially automated methods. We'll expand on this definition a little bit later. So of these, how many are approved? We know from recent AMA research that while approximately 80% of PAs are ultimately approved, nearly 30% are denied the first time around and must be appealed. Between manual and partially automated methods, there's a real difference in time to prepare and submit a PA. Providers and their clinical and admin staff could save about 14 minutes per request by submitting electronically. For health plans to adjudicate a request, the range is anywhere from several hours to up to 26 days. So what's the cost here? It's estimated that all of this costs the provider community over $450 million per year and health plans $94 million per year. This complexity really affects patients. 90% of providers recently surveyed by the AMA reported that the PA process frequently delays access to necessary care. Next slide, please. So throughout our presentation today, we'll be referring to a truncated version of the PA process, which you see here on the screen, as well as a concept we call the automation spectrum. If you think about the PA process end to end, keeping in mind that the entire process often repeats should the initial request be denied, we can largely bucket the flow into 3 major parts. Later in this presentation, we'll dive deeper into the steps within each part, but bear with us for now at this high level. Part A starts with what we refer to often as the trigger event, which is the provider seeing a patient and identifying the need for a medical service. The provider will need to identify if a prior auth is even required for the patient to receive that service, if the PA is in fact required, the provider will then need to identify what information the health plan needs to authorize the request. Finally, the provider must collect all of this information. Part B is all about the complex fusion and iterative back and forth between providers and health plans. It includes the provider submitting the PA request to the plan, followed by the health plan's receipt of the PA request, which is often followed by a request for the provider to send over additional supporting clinical documentation or tasks. This request for and submission of additional documentation can occur many times, back and forth, back and forth. Later on, we'll dive deeper into this complexity. Finally, we define Part C as when the health plan has possession of all the information they need in order to make a final decision about the patient service. They'll need to carefully review the info, which often contains quite a bit of clinical documentation, and then send an approval or denial response back to the provider. Each part I just described utilizes some mix of manual methods and partially automated methods, but they all fit somewhere along the spectrum you see on the bottom half of the slide. We define manual as steps that require human intervention. Think of tools like phone and fax. Partially automated in this context, which is the yellow color in the middle, means that some steps of the PA process are automated, but some still require human touch. The key here is that the manual steps could benefit from automation. Fully optimized refers to a future state PA process that yields efficiencies by automating steps of the process and eliminating unnecessary human intervention. Let's move to the next slide. So now that we've set the stage with some common facts and descriptions, let's take a high-level look at what the industry is doing about this PA challenge. We'll start with CAQH Core. Core's vision for prior auth is to introduce targeted change to propel the industry collectively forward to a PA process that is optimized by automation, which will reduce burden on providers and health plans and improve timely delivery of patient care. The Phase 4 Core operating rules establish critical infrastructure requirements for electronic information exchange. The rule sets expectations on response time, acknowledgement of receipt of the request, real-time and batch processing requirements, amongst other foundational requirements. This was an incremental step for the industry and offers real implementable system improvements. We recently launched Phase 4 certification, so definitely reach out to us if you're interested or want any more info on this. Given strong core participant interest, core board support, and CBHS's recommendation to build additional PA operating rules, and significant industry interest, CORE is now working on building on the basics established with the Phase 4 rules. Next slide, please. Other industry organizations, of which many of you online are affiliated with, are actively working on PA as well, further signaling that the time is now for CAQH Core to develop additional operating rules on PA. All of our organizations can benefit from identifying synergies and potential alignment. For example, CORE identified that our current opportunity areas for potential rules for PA have crossover with quite a few of the AMA's PA and utilization management reform principles. We've presented CORE's efforts on PA at HADA, HIMSS, and WEDI, and we are tracking X12 development of draft 7030 to consider potential impact to the transaction. CORE participates in the WEDI PA subwork group, which is selecting leading practices, as well as the WEDI Council, which is a group dedicated to enhancing this collaboration and synergy. As CORE's PA subgroup launches and develops rules, we'll continue to track these industry efforts and align wherever possible. We'll also be monitoring state-level policy development and potential legislation related to PA. So that wraps up our intro portion. I will now turn it back over to Jessica for our first polling question.
Thank you, Rachel. That was very informative, and it leads us to our first polling question. So we've already done a vendor assessment on this work. So this question is targeted to providers and health plans. So we'd like only providers and health plan representatives to answer this polling question, which is, would you be willing to be interviewed by CAQH Core staff about best practices and challenges in your PA process? So let's launch the poll. Your options are yes, no, unsure, and already interviewed. So we'll give you a little bit of time to respond, and then we'll share the results. And I may ask my colleagues from CAQH, after I've shared the results, to maybe talk a little bit about what this might entail, so that folks who answered yes or unsure kind of know what's coming. Okay, let's share the results. Okay, so we've got a fairly large percentage of yeses and unsures. So Rachel or Bob, when might we be contacting these people? What would this entail, just so that they know what's coming?
And I can jump in. Yeah, over the next couple of weeks, we would like to reach out to those folks that responded yes and get an idea. We actually like an interview schedule and an interview tool that we use as we walk through some of those pain points and challenges that different entities, both providers and health plans, have when it comes to prior authorization. And they are customized by stakeholder type. So we've done several interviews as we prepped, and we'll talk about that in just a moment for our environmental scan, and we'll walk through some of those findings. But any additional interviews and any additional insights can definitely be used as the subgroups gets ready to launch. So thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Bob. And now for our next segment, we have two speakers. Our first speaker is Kim Peters, who oversees all the EDI data receipt and transmission for Humana, and he works extensively with WEDI and X12 to provide direction and oversight for Humana interests related to new government regulations and transaction compliance related projects. In addition, we have Bob Bowman, who is Associate Director for Transactions at CAQH Core. And Kim and Bob will walk us through the CAQH Core Advisory Group activities in prior auth. Let's get started with Kim. Welcome, Kim. Kim, are you on the line?
You didn't hear me? Can you hear me now?
We hear you now. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Welcome.
All right, thank you for the invite and the opportunity to speak to the group. And, you know, I'm anxious to get something up and running for the prior authorization process. Today, I'm talking about the Prior Authorization Advisory Group that was launched back in November of 2016. And it was a group of major stakeholders across the industry, health plans, providers, and vendors. And we had very active participation by all advisory group members. We kicked off by reviewing a draft list of opportunity areas that are available within the prior authorization process. When we conducted the interview and environmental scan, which we did a deeper dive into the next few slides, we narrowed down the list of potential opportunities areas that were available as we talked through the different candidates and what they're doing today in the industry and how they're using prior authorization today. We determined that there was all types of potential opportunities out there, but we had to figure out which one were the best ones to actually attack in the given time frame. So the environmental scan was meant to investigate what the industry barriers were to adoption of electronic PA. We had over 100 entities participate in the scan, and via the core participant survey, as well as site visits, provider interviews, and vendor assessments, we developed this list. And then we, as a group, looked at all the data that was gathered and then did a deeper dive on what were the ones that we wanted to actually bring into the list for attacking on the first go around. I think there's a lot of potential that we can do later on in the process, but the first go around, we narrowed down the list of what we thought was achievable. So across the board, we found that despite the presence of electronic options for PA, manual processes are still preferred and often seen as a more efficient and faster opportunity. Stakeholders are not incentivized to adopt existing electronic methods that address only small chunks of the process and leave the rest of the process to human touch. So, you know, we have some payers and providers out there that are doing PA electronically. And then we have a lot larger chunk of the business out there that are still doing the manual process. So what we're trying to do is figure out how do we get the ones that are still doing it manually to adopt the electronic process and realize that, you know, the potential savings and the benefit to the industry by going electronic. So some of them have pointed to the lack of capabilities in the industry. One of the things that's, you know, a barrier is multiple websites at different places they have to go to do electronic referrals and authorizations. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out how do we enhance this by building a better operating model with core operating rules, and figure out, you know, how do we get everybody to adopt this process so we can actually get the industry moving along the prior authorization path like they have for claims and referral, or not referrals, but eligibility and benefit transactions and the other transactions we're doing today, like 276, 277. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob to go into a more detailed explanation of the PA process and how it varies in its maturity on the automation spectrum.
Great, thanks, Kim. And as Kim said, the environmental scan was really helpful for core staff as well as the advisory group to consider the original set of opportunity areas that we originated back late last year. And it also helped us determine, as you can see in this slide, exactly where each component of that, really the major part of the PA process, is on that particular automation spectrum. So as you can see here, part A was the provider prepares for the PA request and pulls the data from different systems, his EHR, his PMS, the paper file. That is completely a manual process today. For all intents and purposes, the entire environmental scan pointed to almost completely manual. When we move to part B, the provider and health plan, as they exchange the information, there are different systems available. Many plans have portals available. Sometimes there's upload functionality for attachments. Sometimes there's a way to send the attachment through EDI. There's lots of different ways that this communication between the provider and the health plan has been partially automated. It still takes a human touch to upload the file or data enter the elements for the PA on the portal, or there's a manual search and find for the PDF file, for example. All of that is partially automated for that exchange of data and information related to the prior authorization. Moving into part C, the health plan reviews and approves or denies the PA request. This is also mostly a manual process. Much of the data comes in. It does require a human touch to review the data, ensure that all of the particular attachments are there or not, inform the provider if something is missing, and then review any additional documentation that comes in. And so that process is often manual on the health plan side as they're adjudicating the prior authorization. Overall, this points to the fact that there's a lot of opportunity to move the needle from a manual to an optimized position on the spectrum through operating rules. If we move to the next slide, we can also see that the environmental scan helped us identify different pain points by the different stakeholder types, particularly by providers. Again, manual checking for what particular services require a PA, because those types of things change. Health plans do publish those lists. Those lists are updated on a monthly, weekly, or ad hoc basis. So the providers often reacted that the goalpost always keeps changing because they don't know exactly what the requirements are, because they do change, and that's very needful change, right? The health plans do have to make those changes, but it makes it more difficult for the providers. So the providers often will drop to a telephone or a fax for that PA request, or just to see if the particular service requires a prior authorization. Other types of issues that the providers reported were that the proof for medical necessity varies by health plan and by state. Many manually collect the provider information from different systems. They're trying to pull them again from the EHR, the PMS, from paper files, and pull them all together to understand exactly what is required for the PA. The submission methods also vary by health plan. Some do support the 278 transaction, They also have telephone, they have web portals, they have fax, they have IVR, all different ways of submitting, so the provider has options. But oftentimes they rely on the phone and fax because that seems to be the most reliable option. They know they get a confirmation by fax. They know that they can call, and within 30 minutes of that telephone call, they can ensure that the PA is approved. So although there are a variety of methods for submission, providers are relying on the ones that seem to be the most stable and the most reliable, to the ones that actually give a response back at the point of service. There's also a little transparency on the status of a request. So if a provider does submit it through a web portal, they don't know exactly what the status of that request is until up to that 14th day in many cases when the PA is required to be responded to, and then they get the notice that it's been denied or approved. So that window between submission and the final adjudication is agonizing for providers because they're trying to schedule patient care, they're trying to get the patients in for their next service and schedule those, and that window is a black hole for the providers in many cases. Providers usually manually fax information in rather than using any electronic methods of submission, just due to the inconsistency across health plans. Every health plan does it just a little bit differently, or has a different tool, or a different window, or a different portal. And so one default that all health plans still support is fax. So providers know they can fax it in. Vendors also report that there's been a lot of development on the vendor side for tools for the 278 for the prior authorization process, but there's been a lack of adoption by providers. So there's lots of great tools, even new tools are just coming out of the market, but they're still all reporting the lack of adoption. So it makes it harder for vendors to continue those types of solutions and the support for those solutions if there's no adoption. Again, some of that is because the lack of inconsistencies across health plans, across states, as well as the different types of information that must be exchanged, as well as low provider adoption. Health plans also, while they receive most health plans do receive prior authorization requests via an electronic method. Most still use a manual process for the adjudication to determine medical necessity, to review an attachment document. Most of that final decision process is manual. The receipt of additional documentation from providers is often via fax, so that is also additional time and a cost compared to an electronic solution or method too. If we can move to the next slide, we can kind of show you visually what the advisory group process was. And again, very simple process, but we initially had, as Ken mentioned, that initial draft set of opportunity areas, and it was extensive. And all of the core participants on the phone today had the opportunity to review those opportunities and complete the core participant survey. And so the findings from that survey, we ranked those opportunity areas into a high, medium, and low bucket. Plus, we took the findings from the environmental scan. An environmental scan included the interviews, as we mentioned. It included site visits across the country. It included an analysis that we've done and completed with a number of vendors, a vendor assessment. So all of this together combined into the opportunity area average rating. So we took all of the opportunity areas that received a high or a medium level support and moved those forward to the next step. All the ones that received really low levels of support, and this is again across the entire industry, across the core participants, those low dropped out of the process at that point. And I believe there was only a couple. Then we went through really the suitability evaluation, and that suitability evaluation included a set of evaluation criteria. And again, for many of you that have been part of the core process for a long time, this is the same exact process that we've used in the development of any other opportunity rule set that we've done to date. And these are particularly important because the evaluation criteria help us define, it's part of our core principles, it's part of our board evaluation criteria. We also have the advisory group developed a set of prior authorization evaluation criteria that's specific to the PA. So we went through that suitability matrix with the advisory group. And from the advisory group's work, we moved forward the opportunity areas, the 6 you see on screen, as the 6 opportunity areas that receive the highest level of support through the entire process. The median and the low is dropped out at this point. So again, this is this exact same process and method that we've used for every other rule set that we've developed. And this allows us to work on something that's very nuanced, very important, as well as we can make sure that we can plot results and develop rules that are specific to each of these opportunity areas. Now I want to overlay this across the PA process and see what our intent is on the next slide. As Rachel mentioned, the opportunity process falls into these three main buckets as we've defined them for you. And we've broken them up into a little more detail here, and we've color-coded them with where they're manual, partially automated, and again, manual on the health plan review and approve side. So you kind of see the entire process and as it sits in the automation spectrum. The intent of any development of operating rules is to actually change the needle, move the needle from a manual process to a more optimized solution. If we click the next button, the opportunity areas that we've identified will hit each component, each of these main components in a very specific way. And so we hope that through the development of the operating rules, adoption of the operating rules, we can move the needle from those reds and yellows to more yellows and greens to make it fully automated. That's the goal for the opportunity areas that we have, and that's the vision that CORE would have for the prior authorization process. Now, we'd like to just touch on some of those details of the process and where the opportunity areas impact that and can actually move that needle. So we'll walk through a couple of slides to show you the intent of the operating rule. The intent of the particular process point where we're at, and then the challenge that we have, and then the particular opportunity that we have to move the needle. Here in Part A, the provider prepares and submits a PA request. The challenge, the provider has to manually check a list of services requiring PA. It differs across health plans. The list may be outdated, ambiguous. They usually have to pick up the phone and make that validation. So there's the potential, one of the opportunity areas that had very high levels of support was to notify the provider for the PA requirement through the use of the eligibility transaction, the 270, 271 transaction. And that transaction has very high utilization in the industry, much greater than the 278 transaction does. So here's an opportunity to move the needle if health plans and providers and vendors can share that information through the eligibility transaction. Another particular opportunity is when the provider has to identify and collect information for the PA. Some of the challenges, the information needs to provide medical necessity. So standardized information for the requirement for the request of a PA, on the PA request. What type of information does the provider have to submit on a PA request? The other challenge, providers must manually collect patient information from different systems to populate the PA request. Another opportunity area to move the needle that came up is research the best practices for automation of the provider pre-submission process. What's the best way providers have found to date to do this, and can that information be shared across the industry? And if we move on to the next slide, into the next part of the PA process for Part B, we'll find that, again, this is where the provider and the health plan exchange information. A key challenge here was that PA submission methods vary widely by health plan. So some of the methods, again, are partially automated, some are fully automated, and some are completely manual. So providers lack a lack of uniformity of web portals, and they have to always do something if they want to actually conduct the EDI transaction in 278. They'll have to purchase a solution. So the opportunity here is to standardize the information required for a PA request. If every provider knows that every health plan will require a minimum set of information or data, a minimum set of attachments for particular types of prior authorizations, it goes a long way to the provider's knowledge as they prepare for that PA, as they prepare for the submission of the process. If we move to the next slide, we'll move into the actual exchange of information between the provider and the health plan. As Rachel mentioned, this can be an iterative process. Sometimes the provider has to go back and resubmit different forms or different components of data to the health plan, because the health plan needs additional information to make a determination on the prior authorization. So again, part of this also is that once it's submitted, there's a lack of transparency on the status of the PA. So how can a provider be informed of what the status of that PA is as they're trying to, service their members, service their patients, and provide updates to their patients on how and where things are at on the health plan side. So again, an opportunity area is to provide better and more explanation for that pending status of the 278 transaction and appropriate next steps for the provider how they're going to receive that final approval. So we can look at, again, this particular process or challenge and see exactly where the industry can help providers with that type of information that they need. Moving on to the next slide, we'll see that we do also have some opportunity areas related specifically to how health plans often require additional documentation to make a determination. Providers usually have to manually fax that information in rather than relying on an electronic method for that submission. A couple opportunity areas came to the top here, again, with very high levels of support. Again, define a uniform set of accepted formats for that additional documentation. What are those formats for attachments, for example? Another opportunity to move the needle is to ensure that health plans offer an electronic method for the submission of that documentation, rather than just a manual fax or an e-fax. Is there an EDI method for that submission? Bare minimum, right? Often with our operating rules, we establish a floor, not a ceiling, to allow the minimum level or a safe harbor for providers to submit data to a health plan. And we think that's another opportunity here for the prior authorization, especially components for additional documentation or attachments. Moving on to the next slide, we do also address one of our opportunity areas, also address Part C of the health plan review and approve the request. As they receive that request and have to go through their determination process, the adjudication of that PA inquiry, there are lots of challenges there too, right? Most of them use a manual process to make that determination. They have to look at medical necessity, they have to look at the patient coverage, they have to look at the MedRec, they have to make sure that the additional documentation or the attachments are there and that they're valid. That process, there is probably a way for us, and there's been lots of feedback from both health plans and providers of looking at the best practices for automation and what that looks like. Again, we can look at it, see what it looks like today and what that should look like in the future, and share that information with the core body as well as the industry on what those best practices are for trying to become more fully automated in that adjudication of the PA inquiry or the request, and making sure that the industry is aware of that process. So this is another opportunity area, again, that had very high levels of support. If we can move on to the next slide, away from the detail here for the actual parts of the process, we move into a couple of polling questions that we have for you. So I'll send the call back over to Jessica to administer the polling questions.
Thank you, Bob. So our next polling question, what we are trying to do is get a little bit of information from you all of the 6 opportunity areas that Bob described a few slides ago on slide 16 on the right-hand side. Which ones would be of most benefit to your organization? Given the limitations that we have with our webinar setup, we had to combine 2 into 1. So that's why you see 5 here, even though we've been talking about 6 opportunity areas. So I don't want to read the questions and take up too much time, but take a look at these 5 options. It says select all that apply, and let's launch the poll and see what our audience thinks would be of most benefit to their organization. And even though these opportunity areas, from what Bob was talking, received a lot of support, and this will still be a nice gauge for us to see, which opportunities do we start with, which is sort of worth putting more resources into. So your information will be most helpful. So I'm going to give this maybe 5 more seconds, and then we'll share the results. And Bob and Rachel, I would appreciate any feedback on the results. So let's show the results. And there seems to be a clear winner in terms of what would be of most benefit. So the first opportunity area on robust data content requirements. And it looks like the other 4 are pretty close. So what do you all make of these responses?
I'll jump in. I think this is a great way to see that there's definitely some opportunities with the 278 transaction itself, the prior authorization transaction. I think that one thing that this group core has done quite successfully is to look at the standards that exist in the industry and see where there are potential gaps where operating rules can kind of flip the switch, turn on particular data sets or data fields, or look at error codes and error messages within the transaction that might help the provider. Again, if they submit that information, it could help the health plan adjudicate the transaction more fully. If the health plan could send more data to the provider so the provider can actually conduct an action with that data, that helps the provider and helps probably the patient as well at that point. I think that this group has seen that success story with the other transactions that we've done, and this is something definitely we can look at for the 278 or the prior authorization transaction as well.
Thank you, Bob. And Bob's going to set the stage for the next polling question. Let's go on to the next slide.
As one of the opportunity areas that came up with very high levels of support throughout the entire environmental scan, between the survey and the environmental scan, was that the use of a 270-271 transaction. It does support the submission of specific procedure codes within the transaction that would allow providers to have data specific to a procedure code related to prior authorization requirements. We know that this is something that is quite advanced within the eligibility transaction and also very difficult to implement on the health plan side because of the structure and nature of benefit plans and structures and the data and the way that the data is actually stored in databases. But we've heard from several plans that they are working on this ability for providers to do this, and some have even implemented it. So we're wondering if for those plans or for those software vendors and clearinghouses that are available, or any of the providers that are out there that have their own systems, do you plan on supporting this? Do you currently support it? Do you not support these yet to date, or are you unsure if it just doesn't apply to you? We'd like to have that information from you as well. We're just trying to see where the environment, where the industry is at.
Okay, so let's launch the poll. Okay, so let's give this a few more seconds and then we'll share the results and see if there's, let's go ahead and share the results and see what we learned from our audience. So it looks like 41% are not using the procedure codes, 21% are unsure, 18% are using the procedure codes, 15% does not apply, and 5% are planning on using the procedure code. So we've got 18 plus 5 are sort of yes or close to yes. Is this what you expected, Bob, or is this some kind of an interesting?
I think it's a great question. I think that I'm surprisingly startled by the number that reported that they are currently using procedure codes. So that's great information, and perhaps we can reach out to those folks to understand exactly what those processes are and how they work through that, because this is going to be an important component as we look forward to some of those best practices within the industry on how to support these types of transactions that really add value to the provider.
Great, and that's why we appreciate so much your attending today's webinar and giving us some of this great information. So Bob, I'm gonna send it right back to you to talk about the PA subgroup.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And we do want to share the information about the launch of the core PA subgroup again, the intent and all the effort that our wonderful advisory group did was to help set up the subgroup so they can actually kind of hit the ground running. In past processes, we usually started this entire process with the subgroup, but we knew with this particular topic, as complex as it is, with as many different types of opportunity areas, sometimes some of them not specific to the transaction itself, right? We're looking at things beyond just the 278 transaction. We use the advisory group method to help us kind of winnow it down to some easy, more navigable, and more milestone approach, so we can look at these things in a very specific way. Again, with our 6 top opportunity areas that we need to address, we want to make sure that we're moving away from the current state to a future state that's more optimized for electronic, more automated transactions. Again, it will definitely improve both providers, health plans, and vendors, how they conduct the transaction. Again, all leading hopefully to reducing the unnecessary delays in patient care, help simplify the process for PA, simplify the submission of additional documentation, hoping to reduce resources and costs, right, from the provider. Again, same thing for health plan. If we can encourage electronic receipt and processing of attachments to support the PA, that will save labor costs and development costs on the health plan side. Again, make it easier to receive and process the PA. All of the opportunity areas kind of point to these types of improvements for each of our main constituencies. Moving on to the next slide. As we think about, as you think about, and as your organization thinks about joining the subgroup, we want to make sure that we definitely, as CORE always does, have that cross-stakeholder group that includes both providers, health plans, clearinghouses, and software vendors. We want to make sure that we can have a very specific targeted change for the industry. So our goal, again, is to ensure that we're expanding upon the foundation set by phase 4 operating rules, which included all of the infrastructure requirements for the 278 transaction to be in place. And we are seeing lots of entities moving towards implementing the operating rules and becoming certified on phase 4, which does include the 278. The deliverables then for the subgroup will be to draft high-level requirements for a select set of operating rules by the end of this year, develop an interim report summarizing the research on potential best practices for the automation of parts of the PA process, and that could be both at the provider side as well as the health plan side, and sharing that with the industry. A third milestone would be to continue the rule development process for some of the opportunity areas. They don't fall into these first 2 buckets, but we want to make sure that we continue that process through 2018. So it's basically an 18-month commitment as we roll this forward. We've been working on it for just over 6 months as an advisory group, and now the subgroup, we want them to be engaged as we kind of tackle these problems with a prior authorization. So the subgroup would launch in September of this year. There would be short-term, mid-term, and long-term timelines for the deliverables, and we'll have those spelled out for the subgroup. We do generally have a 90-minute call every other week, so it's twice a month. We'll have a 90-minute call as we work through those goals and those deliverables for each of those timeframes. With that, I'll hand the call back over to Jessica for our last and final polling question.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you for presenting the subgroup so well, because now in the last polling question, we can ask you if you or your organization are interested in participating in the PA subgroup. We value your experience and expertise, and we want you to do this with us. So let's launch the poll. The responses are yes, please reach out to me, unsure, would need more information, and no, not at this time. So let's give the audience a little bit of time to respond. And we won't share these results, but for those of you who said yes or unsure, we will reach out to you and thank you in advance. So let's give this a little bit more time, get a little bit more percentage of the audience to respond. Okay, let's give it 5 more seconds, then we'll close out the poll, and then we'll head to Q&A. Okay, thank you so much in advance. And now we do have some time for Q&A. So if you haven't done so already, go to the questions panel and submit your comment or question. Let's get started with our questions. Oh, so one kind of administrative question is how to access the slides. They'll be on our website in a day or so, and we'll also send them to you. So don't worry, you'll get them. Another question regarding the subgroup, if folks weren't sure whether they could participate because they need to get permission from their leadership, and they need to know who they can reach out to join. Either email us at CAQH, what's our website? core@caqh.org. Thank you.
So that's core@caqh.org. Definitely reach out to us.
So there's a question about how we're coordinating with other efforts such as WEDI. Rachel or Bob, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, definitely, I can jump in. I know that, as you may not have been seen on one of the previous slides, one of the earliest slides, Heather McComas from the AMA is both working on the WEDI subwork group as well as a member of the advisory group for here at CAQH Core on our advisory group. So that helps greatly with kind of coordinating some of the efforts, as well as CAQH Core staff are part of the WEDI subwork group, as well as a member of the WEDI Council on Prior Authorization. So we are definitely trying to work very closely with any initiatives within the industry, not just WEDI, but all others, as Rachel mentioned. We've presented at HIMSS, we've worked with HADA, we've continuously look at the AMA and the work that they're doing in this initiative as well. I'm sorry, on their initiatives for prior authorization over the last couple of years. And we've done, and we'll continue to do extensive research, not only the current industry initiatives, but we've also seen a lot of activity in the states. And a lot of the states are moving forward with legislation, particularly around prior authorization requirements. So if folks are on the line and are not aware of those things, the advisory group will be made aware of those. We are doing extensive outreach with our state initiatives, making sure that we understand those, if there's any barriers or anything that might impact prior authorization in that way at the state level, will be part of and continue to be part of our work with the subgroup.
Thanks, Bob. So I know that we have just given you a ton of information to process. I want to give you a little bit more time to ask some more questions. Okay, so another question we just got in was, a little bit about our work on attachments. For example, is there an plans for an attachment subgroup, etc.?
No, that's a great question. And CORE is definitely continuing to do our research on attachments. We do have an initiative this year that we've launched earlier this year with an education series on attachments. We'll be hosting our third and fourth webinar this year, just in a month or two. Our third one should be launched. And what we're continuing to do is part of that environmental scan. I mentioned that for the prior authorization process, we're still in the midst of that process for the attachment and the attachment standards and the process that is used and the technology that is used. So we do a pretty extensive environmental scan really before we launch most projects. So we are part of that initial part of the environmental scan that's taking place now for attachments. And so we're also engaged with HL7. We're engaged with many of the initiatives that are going on within the industry around attachments. So more work to be done, and you'll definitely hear more about attachments from CAQH Core as we move forward. We do plan on, I believe, launching an advisory group on attachments a little bit later this year or into next year.
Thank you, Bob. So since we do have a couple of minutes, our speakers, do you want to make any final comments to our audience?
This is Kim. I'll speak up. That Humana has a very extensive authorization referral process, automated today, and we've seen a lot of benefit from that process. So I encourage everybody to go out there and investigate, how you can actually enhance your process if you have some automation already. The more real time you can make it, the better your opportunity is, because you can actually receive a submission of a request for an authorization, automatically respond in real time mode. That if you need additional information, it can be conversational, and get the job done in a very quick fashion. So we're seeing anywhere from 75 to 90% success rate on auths and referrals today.
Thank you, Kim. We appreciate you being with us here today.
Yeah, and a big thank you. This is Rachel Goldstein, to our CAQH Core Prior Auth Advisory Group. We were really excited to share all the work that you've done over the past many months, and we know many of you are on the call today and very supportive of the work moving forward. We thank you very much for your commitment, your time, and your energy, and thanks very much.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. And again, please email us at core@caqh.org. Aha, it was right in front of me. If you'd like more information on PA or any other topics, or if you'd like to join the subgroup. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.